Vampires are real in fictional pirate world, which really shouldn't come as too much of a surprise given all of the other crap it is we've already seen, particularly in the realm of horror. We've seen ghosts, both fruit generated by Perona, as well as confirmation that human souls do exist and can act independently of a corporeal form. Zombies happen to be a thing thanks to Gecko Moria, although it's also been implied that they've existed outside of his powers as well. We also have a ton of yokai in recent One Piece, with Emu and the Five Elder Stars, and even werewolves somewhat exist through the Ming tribe and their Sulong transformations whenever there is a full moon. Spiritual werewolves, we'll call them. So if seemingly every other monster exists, what is the big deal with vampires, which do at least conceptually exist in One Piece, as well as much more, but we're starting here. When the crew first encountered Brook at the beginning of Thriller Bark, Usopp clads himself in a wide variety of protective materials, including a cross and garlic, which are traditionally quite effective vampire repellents. But when it's revealed that Brook doesn't have a reflection, the first response from the crew as a whole was to assume that Brook is a vampire. And vampires were pretty clearly quite a heavy inspiration for Brook's situation, as well as anyone else affected by Moria's shadow stealing abilities. They go on to lose their reflections, but also inherit the unfortunate and very vampiric weakness of bursting into flames when coming into contact with direct sunlight. So those affected by Moria gain none of the benefits of vampirism, but quite a few of the weaknesses. And Oda references vampires fairly regularly in more meta One Piece media, by which I mean something that isn't directly part of the story. The first time this happens is actually as early as chapter 14 of the series, where Luffy is drawn in a very vampiric pose, flanked by chonk bats. But my favorite example is when Oda went full vampire with Luffy on this cover of Weekly Shonen Jump, giving him funky fangs, a delicious drink of blood liquids, and an adorable chopper bat as a familiar. Even before we get to the very real vampires, vampirism leaks into One Piece a lot. Oda really likes to go back to the old blood well every few years to use them for inspiration. And most people immediately identify Dracula Mihawk as a rather spooksome character inspired by vampires, as his first appearance leaves many people questioning whether or not he flat out is a vampire. What with the eyes, the candles, the coffin vote, and just the whole vibe, you know? But the thing that gets most people is the name. And on that, I will say that in English, Mihawk's vampire inspiration is a bit overstated. A lot of people point to his name, Dracule, or Dracule, or Dracula, and figure that it's obviously inspired by that, because there is only one letter of difference. All that Oda's done here is change an A for an E, and that's what we got. That's how it's been translated in English anyway. But in Japanese, the difference is significantly more pronounced, quite literally pronounced. Dracula in Japanese would be Dorakura, whereas Mihawk's name is Jurakiru. And look, it's not the craziest difference in the world. Some of the sounds are the same, kind of, but it's nowhere near the obvious reference that it would be in English. And as a result, in the early 2000s, this difference was strong enough that fan translations were translating Mihawk's name as Jurakil or even Jurakil. But look, here is my personal speculation as to what has happened here. Eiichiro Oda is, and never has been, amazing with other languages, despite taking heavy inspiration from them and using them muchly. And this comes across when romanizing names such as Charlotte Lin Lin. When writing her name in a Roman alphabet, Oda will sometimes write it as Lin Lin and other times as Rin Rin, because the L and R sound are combined in Japanese. Oda just doesn't really care to distinguish, and so he just writes it whichever the crap way he wants at the time. Which we can also see happening with The Reverie, which Oda has since officially romanized as The Leverly. And really, anytime there's English written directly by Oda, you can count on something fun to happen, like Boa Hancock being the pirate Empress in the color spread of chapter 921, or Sanji notoriously reading a book all about cocking in chapter 1081. What I'm trying to say here is that Mihawk is pretty obviously inspired by Dracula, and what I think happened is that Oda just misspelled Dracula, or he spelt it according to how he thought it would work when Mihawk was first created, and just committed to that from then since. But the big question is, how far do Mihawk's vampire inspirations go? Do they go all the way? Well, on that, I should say that we've only ever seen Mihawk drink, never eat. Once was a glass of what was assumed to be red wine, but could also be the bloods of his victims. And another time we saw him drink what we assumed to be tea, but could also be the mulled blood of his victims. Although according to the little spat he had with Perona, Mihawk does also cook a lot, and the anime even gives us this fun filler scene of Mihawk using his title of world's greatest sous chef to chop a colossal pickle, because that is what humans eat. We've also seen Mihawk out in the sun many times, which is not classic vampiric behavior, tends to result in death. But as this video goes on, we'll see that Oda has never gone full classic vampire with any of his vampires, so this isn't necessarily a deal breaker for Mihawk, especially when he's wearing his lovely wide-brimmed sun hat. Although using a sword shaped like a cross sounds like it would hurt a lot as a vampire, as well as having that smaller cross around his neck. And so the only reason why vampire Mihawk isn't completely ridiculous at this stage is because of his eyes. Something is up with Mihawk's focal orbs, as the only other characters we've seen with eyes like Mihawk are Zunesha and Emu, both of whom are beings that are effectively immortal. Zunesha was sentenced to walk the planet for all eternity, and immortal is a pretty important prerequisite for eternal punishment. Am I suggesting that we're dealing with a vampire elephant here? Maybe, but also probably not. Meanwhile, Emu appears to be at least 800 to 900 years old, and I don't think that this is just a stylistic choice by Oda. These eyes are purposely and selectively used by Oda, and something very relevant is that while Mihawk's eyes are usually yellow in the anime, in the manga they are red and look exactly like Emu's eyes. With that said, Mihawk probably isn't a vampire. I would not bet units of currency on that. He's more like a 39-year-old dude who just never got out of his goth phase. But other characters in One Piece certainly are vampires, such as Stussy, clone of Stussy, who possesses the Bata Bata no Mi, which is exactly what it sounds like, the bat fruit, and this has from time to time been mistaken for an outright vampire fruit, as in a mythical Zoan model vampire, but it's actually a basic Zoan fruit. However, it is a fruit based on the surprisingly real vampire bats that do exist, and Stussy reflects many of their qualities, such as being the only known mammals whose nutritional needs are made up of blood from other creatures, and in the anime, Stussy also displays this funky thermal blood vision, which is something that real-life vampire bats have. They can see infrared thermal radiation. So technically, this is a carnivorous Zoan because it feeds off other creatures, and those have been noted as particularly difficult to grasp with mentally for the users, because the user of a carnivorous Zoan is subject to those intense cravings and the animalistic identity of the creature in question. So it's very possible here that Stussy has gone full vampire bat and only sustains herself off blood, or at the very least that is her meal of choice. Kind of like Mihawk, we've only ever seen Stussy consume liquids, and there is one liquid other than blood that she drank in the past, but I honestly don't know if this was much better. During Big Mom's tea party, Stussy indulged in a glass of weird screaming giraffe, which was apparently rather tasty and smooth. However, this was arguably kind of vampiric in nature, as Smoothie was extracting the very essence and life force of her victims to create these special drinks. But what we've done here is effectively use the power of fictional fruit to create a vampire. We've taken the vampire bat creature and we have fused it with a human. And given that Stussy is a clone, she may not be unique in this endeavor. The original Miss Buckingham Stussy may also have this bat fruit, although I will say that her rather visible aging goes to show that it may not give Stussy the most desirable vampire traits, not the ones that most characters become vampires to achieve, being that good old eternal youth. For that, we'd have to find the proper vampire mythical Zoan fruit, which does exist. The Bata Bata no Mi model vampire is a proper mythical Zoan consumed by Patrick Redfield, and it predates the reveal of Stussy's basic bat fruit by almost 10 whole years. Mr. Redfield was the main antagonist of One Piece Unlimited World Red, and his devil fruit did allow access to eternal youth by draining the life force of those around him, which resulted in a rather dramatic climax featuring an old and withered Luffy. So it has nothing to do with blood sucking, but it has all the good parts of being a vampire without all of those messy mechanical bits. Of course, Patrick Redfield is extremely non-canon, but he was designed by Eiichiro Oda aesthetically, personalitically, and of course his devil fruit abilities, which would later partially be used as inspiration for Stussy's canon fruit ability. The point is, it wasn't some game designer who came up with the idea, and conceptually it is something that naturally fits into the One Piece world, and it is yet another example of Oda's fascination with vampires. And also, due to this non-canon game fruit, vampire theories did for some time enter what I call the Scopogaban tier of theory crafting, by which I mean for most of One Piece the immediate fan response to a new unknown character being introduced was to claim that it was Scopogaban that was always the first stop, and one day that did turn out to be true, but only after 27 years of perpetually saying it. The vampire idea was quite similar. Every new character introduced with an ability tangentially related to some sort of youth was suddenly labeled as a vampire. Back during her introduction, Jewelry Bonnie was given the vampire treatment by fans who suspected that she was something of a non-traditional vampire that could both drain and restore life force without all of the messy blood suckery, which resulted in her aging effect. And the idea was that Bonnie was a being who had lived for countless centuries by absorbing the life force of those around her. I'm definitely not saying these series were good. In fact, every time the word vampire comes up, I do have to mentally brace myself for a mind crash. The most recent incarnation of this idea was actually that Emu was a vampire operating on a similar principle of sustaining himself on the energy of sourced victims for the past 800 to 900 years. And not only that, but he'd been a vampire for so long that it explains why he no longer really resembles a human. In most media, the older a vampire is, the more they evolve, or I guess devolve into something resembling more of a beast, as they slowly lose more and more of their humanity over the years. Although by far the most interesting argument for vampire Emu that I ever saw was the existence of Dracunculus vulgaris, also known as the vampire lily, with this sliver of black in the center pretty much looking exactly like Emu. And vampires aside, because Emus have gone far beyond that, but at this point, I do still think that this flower is very interesting and a potential strong inspiration for Emu visually, just because lilies are a core part of his character. He of course has had this millennia-long obsession with Nefertari D-Lily, and within Emu's private sanctuary he exclusively grows lilies, probably as a tribute to Lily herself, but just knowing about the existence of the vampire lily, Emu looks right at home in this garden. And there was also the classic vampiric idea of Emu granting the five elders immortality, but we now understand that that contract is far crazier and potentially far less consensual than anything that vampire Emu ever brought to the table. But there was a thematic argument for Emu's vampirism as well, as he saw the sun god as his enemy, a man who would bring about the dawn of the world, which sounds like quite a core threat to a vampire. And also part of this drive was to connect Emu to Mihawk and explain why they have the same eyes, which is still very much a link worth exploring, just maybe not through vampires. So the thing is, I'm not sure why people go to the most extreme out there ideas when it comes to vampires, especially when we already have something so much more substantive. It just involves far less exciting characters, as we may actually have genuine non-magical fruit-based vampires in One Piece in the form of the monarchy of the Lucia Kingdom, being King Seki and Princess Kumane. Seki's name is inspired to be theorized by the Sekuli people, a Hungarian subgroup living in Romania, and notable Sekuli figures include Count Dracula, who was a Sekuli in Bram Stoker's original novel, and in addition to that, King Seki and his daughter Princess Kumane favor impalement as punishment for just about every crime that could be committed, which is an obvious nod to Dracula's Vlad the Impaler heritage. But look, King Seki has vampire fangs. The dude was made to suck you off. I mean, the dude was made to suck your blood out of you. You know what? Why even try to fix it? I said what I said. But his former kingdom of Lucia was not always a horrible place. For one thing, we did see it as quite bright and peaceful during Ace's cover story, and Oda has said that King Seki only came to power during the 2-year time skip, instantly tanking the island's well-being to the point now where it no longer exists at all. That's one of the really sad things about Lucia. If it wasn't for King Seki coming to power and then being a prick, then no one would have needed to rebel against him. While Lucia was a member of the world government prior to Seki's ascension, he greatly exacerbated the plight of the civilians, not only making them pay the heavenly tribute to the world nobles, but also a separate tribute to him as well. And without him, the Revolutionary Army may not have stopped there, Belo Betty wouldn't have used her powers on its people, and Lucia would not have become Emu's target to test the ancient weapon Uranus. So he's quite the impactful character in the grand scheme of One Piece, and the anime actually expands on his history somewhat. In episode 889, there is some filler dialogue added of King Seki speaking to another monarch, whose name is Queen Lemon Cheese, from the most creatively named island in all of the One Piece world, the Best Land Kingdom. And just as the Reverie meeting is about to commence, they are making monarchish small talk, with a Lemon Cheese asking Seki how his country has been, and that she heard it was ravaged by pirates 4 years ago, with King Seki replying that thanks to Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, all of those pirates have now been sent to impel down. And at first this seems a bit jarring because, as we know, Seki only became king 2 years ago, and this Lemon Cheese is speaking to him like he was present for the last Reverie 4 years ago, like they were old friends. My guess would be that Seki did attend the last Reverie, but as a prince, much like how Vivi came to a Reverie with King Cobra, implying that the royalty of Lucia may be a long line of vampires, or at least biologically vampire-presenting people, or the anime just forgot when they wrote this filler dialogue. The latter is probably more likely, but it doesn't matter because it can be explained away in world easily enough. But the Lucia royalty is a lot more prominent in One Piece than most people remember, as Seki's daughter, Princess Kumane, is also the person who Kobe is sent to rescue just prior to the Reverie, and it's because of her that Kobe got to meet Rebecca and Kuros from Dressrosa. And as far as the rules of vampires go, we never see Seki or Kumane contradict those rules. We never see them eat, so we have no idea if they need to drink the bloods. We also don't get their opinions on garlic. We don't see them look at themselves in a mirror or see how they react to crucifixes. And something very suspicious is that in the manga, when Kobe Kobe rescues Kamane, we only see her in the interior of the submarine that held her, and when Seki is at the reverie, we only see him inside. There is only one occasion where we see these two outside, which was in Sabo's flashback retelling of what happened after the reverie. Seki and Kamane were immediately apprehended after returning to Lucia, and they are clearly outside in this panel. However, the thing to remember about Lucia is that at some point in the past 2 years, this kingdom developed a perpetually dark cloud cover, giving it a kind of faux night vibe and making it one of the most perfect locations in the One Piece world for any vampires that did exist to settle. And we do see our vampire monarchs once more in the dungeon before both of them are assumedly obliterated by your anus. So they do kind of meet the typical vampiric end of being reduced to dust by light, but otherwise Oda has very coincidentally or very purposely made sure that neither of them have ever been exposed to direct sunlight. It could definitely be a coincidence because that's just the curse of being a minor character. There's not enough information out there to form a solid conclusion, but if anyone in this series was a vampire without the assistance of fictional fruit, it was definitely this guy.